Hello and welcome back. It's Lois here from Lois and Morgana Davidson Art, and today I'm going to be showing you how I painted this loose watercolour landscape scene. It's a late winter, early spring scene. The leaves aren't yet on the trees in the foreground, but the grass is nice and bright and new, and there's a nice windswept sky. Just before the demo though, a quick reminder that you can still buy my book, Landscapes in Watercolour, Techniques and Tutorials for the Complete Beginner. Of course, it's suitable for intermediates too. There are 10 step-by-steps, 5 pure watercolour and 5 line and wash. And if you're interested, please follow the links in the description below. I'm starting with a very rough sketch in pencil on my watercolour paper, just positioning the different planes of land, the different field and field boundaries, the different positionings of the trees, distant, midground and foreground. I'm using an HB pencil and I'm going to be painting on a piece of Arches rough surface paper. It's taped to my board, and my board's an angle of about 20 to 30 degrees, so when I start to paint, gravity will help me as I paint wet in wet. This is a made-up scene from my imagination, but I looked at a few similar reference photographs on Pixabay first to give me some inspiration. If you want to look at the sketch, then pause the video here. This is my line work, and this will be my roadmap for my painting. I'm going to wet the sky area all over, down as far as the distant tree line, and I'll paint over the distant tree line with my sky. I'm using a large wash brush. This is a Princeton Aqua Elite Mottler brush, 1.5 inches, but any large wash brush that you like to use will do. Just cleaning up the water across the distant horizon line. This is raw sienna, a very pale wash of raw sienna into the sky will just take away from the intensity of my cobalt blue a little bit. Just add a little bit of glow and a little bit of shadow to the sky. So just dragging my sky colour across, leaving some unpainted areas of paper, keeping the sort of directionality in this sort of shadow diagonal. So it's almost as if I'm bringing some perspective into this windswept sky. I've dipped with my cobalt blue brush into some raw umber and a little bit of indigo, not too much. And I'm just using the tips of my brush to just put some paint into my distant tree line. And I'm going over my sky wash so that that tree line will just gently and softly diffuse wet in wet. I've dipped into sepia and indigo, just using the tips of the brush again and putting in a field boundary. Then there's a darker field in the midground. I'm putting that in first. Then a bit later I'll fill in those other fields with sap green. I've now dipped into some quite sort of dark value raw umber and sepia, and I'm using the tips of the brush to pull up these lines to try to give me the impression of weeds and reeds and a tangle of sort of undergrowth at the base of my trees. This is sap green, sweeping that across the foreground very simply. I don't need to sort of fiddle about with that. Just a sweep of the brush to fill in those fields will give me the impression of the fields and the grass that I'm looking for. And now this is indigo, sepia and a little bit of raw umber. And while the sky wash is still damp, I'm using this fairly rich dark value paint to create the canopies of my trees. Now using the palette knife to scrape a bit of texture into the grass and then into the undergrowth below the trees. And these lighter marks add texture and interest to these areas without having to worry too much about too much detail. I can drag through the rich paint on the canopies as well, and this gives me some branch and trunk highlights. A bit later on I shall put in some darker branches and trunks. Now this is a sort of darkish grey, but it'll lighten up quite a lot as it dries, and I'm strengthening up the canopies of my distant tree line. Use the palette knife to create just the suggestion of a few trunks and branches, just to anchor those to the field boundary. And then I'll continue working on the closer trees. Using a size 2 quill brush, I'll eventually swap to a rigger to finish these areas off, and I shall start to put in my taller trees on the right. Just a quick sweep of light value raw sienna across that distant field really sort of brings out the distant trees as well with that lighter value. This is quite rich raw umber that I'm spreading out now with the number 2 quill brush across the base of the tree line in my tangle of undergrowth. Just laying it flat, and I'm now going to sprinkle a bit of salt into that stronger paint and across the foreground. The paint is only just still damp, and where I sprinkle the salt I'll just get some little tiny blooms which will give me the impression of a few spring flowers and maybe the impression of some of the undergrowth under the trees without me having to paint it. I'm just going to quickly scrape through that rich paint with my palette knife so that as the salt creates its effects, it will create them around the look of the sort of sticks and twigs. So that's the bulk of the painting done. I'm now going to leave it to dry completely. So here's the dry painting. I've lifted it back up to about 20 degrees, and now I'm going to work into the dry painting using the wet on dry technique. With the wet on wet technique, everything softens and diffuses when you add the paint. With the wet on dry technique, you get nice crisp hard edges. So I can put some darker detail here and there just to bring the painting together. You can see I'm using a nice sort of dark mix of indigo and sepia here to bring out that distant field boundary. And then I'll emphasise the tree trunks of the distant trees a bit more. And you can see how using the wet on dry technique at this stage of the painting brings together what was looking quite fuzzy and indistinct. It's now making things look a lot clearer. I'm using the number 2 quill brush for this. It comes to a nice point, but you can of course use the rigger for the finer trunk details. And now to these smaller trees nearer to the middle, I'm using the rigger brush, and I've mixed a nice dark from sepia, indigo with a touch of cobalt blue and burnt sienna in it. And I'm working around the marks that I made in the first wash, the wet in wet wash, the edge marks and the painted marks, just to bring these trees together. And just scraping through the rich dark paint with the palette knife is like drawing with a palette knife. It moves that paint around, so I get some different marks, and it adds to the effect of the tangle of branches. Then of course back to the rigger brush for some finer twigs towards the end of these branches. They really stand out nicely against the sky. Now back to the size 2 quill brush and the same dark mixture, and I'm working some lovely dark value marks around my undergrowth, around the base of the trees. And then a quick sweep of this dark colour across the grass just to add in the suggestion of a shadow of something outside of the picture frame falling across the grass, and then back to put in a few more darks. And I forgot to mention that I brushed off any remaining salt crystals that hadn't quite dissolved from the wash. You can just see I've got some really subtle salt effects there, nothing overt. And I think this wet on dry detail has really worked to bring this painting together. And I'm quite happy with that now. I'm going to remove the tape and see how it looks with its clean white border. That'll help us to see whether or not I need to do anything else to it. It lets us look at it with fresh eyes, so to speak. And I'm quite happy with the way this painting has turned out for a practice. I like the depth and distance. I like the way the light is hitting the fields and the sense of aerial perspective, which is created by everything getting paler and more indistinct as we go back further into the distance of the painting. I hope you found the demo helpful. I hope there's something there that you can carry forward and try out in your own work. And if you found it at all helpful, then please give us a thumbs up. And if you're not already subscribed to our channel, why not consider subscribing? It's free to do and it really helps with our reach. And thank you so much to everyone that supports us on Patreon. We really do appreciate you. I'll see you again soon. Take care and happy painting. Bye.